يا هلا فيكم بحفل إعلان مشاركة الكويت في معرض العمارة الدولي في بيينالي فينيسيا. نشكركم على حضوركم. ضيف الشرف الليلة هو معالي السفير الإيطالي السيد فابريزيو نيكولاتي، وأيضا وكيلة وزارة الدولة لشؤون الشباب السيدة زين الصباح، والسيد سامر خنشت الرئيس التنفيذي للعمليات في شركة مشاريع الكويت، والرئيس التنفيذي لشريكنا العقاري شركة العقارات المتحدة السيد محمد السقاف، ونيمة المطر نائب الرئيس التنفيذي في الشركة. يا هلا فيكم. أعرفكم على نفسي، أنا دانا الجودر، معمارية في المكتب العربي للاستشارات الهندسية، وأنا من فريق البحث. أعرفكم على زملائي: زهرة علي بابا، معمارية، النائبة المفوضة للمشاركة، وهي من إدارة الشؤون المعمارية والهندسية في المجلس الوطني للثقافة والفنون والآداب. والفنانة عليا فريد عبدال، القائمة على المشروع، أيضا من قسم الترميم والآثار في المجلس الوطني للثقافة والفنون والآداب. والسيد حسن حياة، معماري في دار استشارات الجزيرة، وعضو في لجنة مشاركة الكويت في بيينالي البندقية. Dear honorable guests, on behalf of the National Council, we welcome you to the announcement of Acquiring Modernity, Kuwait's pavilion at the International Architecture Exhibition of La Biennale di Venezia. Our guests of honor tonight are His Excellency, Mr. Fabrizio Nicoletti, the Italian Ambassador to Kuwait, Undersecretary of the Ministry of State of Youth Affairs, Ms. Zain al-Sabah, Mr. Samir Khanashat, Group Chief Operating Officer of KIPCO and CEO of our real estate partner, United Real Estate Company, Mr. Mohammed al-Saqaf, and Executive Vice President, Mr. Neem al-Matar. We thank you for joining us. I am Dan Al-Jodar, architect at PACE and a member of the Kuwait Pavilion Research Team. On stage with us tonight, we have architect Zahra Ali Baba, who is the Deputy Commissioner from the National Council, our curator, Ms. Alia Farid Abdal, from the Heritage and Restoration Department at the National Council, and Mr. Hassan Hayat, architect at Al Jazeera Consultants and member of the research team. And now, please welcome Ms. Zahra Ali Baba.
مساء الخير. بشكركم جميعا على الحضور هذه الليلة، وأحب أشكر المجلس الوطني للثقافة والفنون والآداب على إعطائنا الثقة والفرصة هذه للمرة الثانية بأن نمثل الكويت في بيينالي فينيسيا. وأحب أشكر السفارة الإيطالية وسعادة السفير على دعمه المتواصل، ووزارة الدولة لشؤون الشباب بالشيخة زين الصباح على الدعم هذا اللي فعلا أسعدنا كلنا. وأحب أشكر شركة العقارات المتحدة لانضمامهم معنا في هذا المشروع. مع دخول الحداثة إلى الكويت صار في I will switch to English. With modernity, our sense of the world has changed, and Kuwait was facing a need to expose itself to the rest of the world, and also there was a huge curiosity to investigate and explore the world. And with the expansion of the city beyond the city walls, and the change in the urban fabric, there were different formats of exploring and translating this new nation image. Can you go faster? Yeah, it's okay. And we can see here through different images, different forms that Kuwait exposed itself through international fairs. المجلس الوطني يهتم في restoration plans ويهتم إنه يحافظ على the major monuments that are present in the country. And one of the major projects that now we're working on at the National Council is preparing nomination dossiers for Kuwait Towers to, inshallah, in the future be nominated as World Heritage location. And this opens the door for us to explore the value of modernity in Kuwait and probably spread awareness to why modern heritage really matters and is worth preserving. I will talk briefly about Kuwait's first participation at Venice Biennale, and it tackled social spaces and social culture and how it affected the urban fabric in Kuwait, and how it, through history and through after modernity, it really changed it affected the urban fabric of Kuwait. And Kuwait's first presence at Venice was through Basia Bahar, Cruel Sea, through the International Film Festival in 1972. And then afterwards, it was in 2012 with the project Kethra. Next. And this was the installation in 2012. Next. 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 And I would like to just explore one thread that the project Kethra tackled 2 years ago. And one of the major components that we worked on was the concept of the void, and how after modernity there was and how we demolished the old city, and there was a major void created in the city. So the city went through different transformations, and also with recently until end of 1970s, the concept of restoration was introduced and within the municipality, and there were different takes on restoration. But through this project, we tried to map recently the different attitudes toward restoration, and how there are alternative practices that we can still find, either through professional scientific restoration, or in the way how the youth react to the built environment. Next. So we took a couple of examples. One of them is we had a look into the practice of Evangelia Samus Ali, who's been recently focusing on, now we call the Sheikh Abdullah al-Jaber palaces. Another example is one of the projects that Dima al-Ghanem worked on, and how she explored the relationship with the city surfaces. Next. But we can also find in literature that there was a sense of the need to preserve and the need to document that the situation, or مرحلة التغيير اللي صارت, and how the society reacted to it. Next. Next. So we started documenting as part of the project these spaces that were left in between, and that were still waiting either for major development projects or just being neglected, and what kind of habitat that actually used these voids. And one of the major components of Kethra project was the research into the archives, and the team that worked on collecting these archives invested their effort and time in gaining access to these archives that were never before that moment in time available to us to study. Next, please. And these archives that we managed to collect 2 years ago were passed on to the team who worked this year as a continuation of the effort and accumulation, hopefully, for the knowledge that was started then. Next. And they constituted the ground and the installation in 2012. Next, please. Next. And can you go back, please? And also, one of them, no, next. Before we went to Venice in 2012, architect Ricardo Camacho also curated, who was part of the curatorial team, curated this conference that was called Kuwait, Modern City of Kuwait. And we had a very interesting discussion back then about the status of, these are just some images of the period of installation in Venice and some images of while we were working. And I would like to share, if any of the Ketra team are here, I would like to share with you that I had a conversation with one of the commissioners and curators of other national pavilions, and they were expressing, who are working this year, and they were expressing that it is kind of difficult for them to find, because usually there are limited budgets invested in these projects, and it's very hard to find people, a large number of groups willing to work very long time and very hard for not so big of a financial compensation. And to me that was a surprise because of our experience in 2012, because we had over 40 almost volunteer-based group who worked day and night, and we didn't have anything defined when we first started, neither financially, neither in terms of the topic, and just seeing how everyone really was pushing just for us to be there and how much it meant for us. And I really felt proud that Kuwait has this energy to offer to the world, where other countries are suffering from finding people who are willing to invest their time in creative and explorations. Next, please. These are just moments from last year's project. And I'd like to thank also Arabana project for granting us the space, and both Abdulatif al-Mashari and Ali Abul Hassan, because having that space, working as an incubator for the research, really fostered and helped us just produce. And at the end, both the Venice Bieennale directors and Dram Koolhaas, the curator of the Biennale this year, created a public program that will be running for 6 months parallel to the national exhibitions, and that they call Freeport or Meetings on Architecture. They still have to decide. And they opened the door to countries to take part of the discussion in Venice. And they offered either we can do exhibitions, panel discussions, or yeah. Next. And we submitted something called أقاليم خيالية مشتركة, or Imagined Shared Territories, and it focuses on the Upper Gulf region, if we could call it that, and it tackles the area where, in between Bobyan Island and El Fao port, we know that there will be major port projects constructed in that region, and due to recent political situations, not so recent, both societies on both borders are facing difficulties in communication, and we're trying through that project to explore a fictional territory through which a new proximity could be designed. Next. And by looking at modernity as moment in history, or recent history, and how it was an exercise in collective imagination. Next. And trying to look at that collective exercise, and maybe that could provide us with data and information to build up and be the basis for this short-term research consortium, in order to provide information for us to come up with this fictional territory. Next, please. I guess that's it. Thank you.
I need to take the blame for the delay. It was my presentation that was jamming up the technology up there. Sorry for that, and thank you for your patience and being with us here tonight for the announcement of Acquiring Modernity. For those of you, it needs to be louder. So I'm going to begin my presentation with a slide of, it's an image on the on your left of where Zahra and I sat at the announcement of the 2014 Venice Biennale. And it was the national participants meeting. And you'll see from where we're sitting the head of Ram Koolhaas, who, as he's announcing kind of the overarching theme of the exhibition. So the way the Venice Biennial exhibition works is that they always invite an international curator who announces an overarching theme. And the countries who are participating that year can either respond to this subject that the international curators announce or kind of work on their own. But because this year is Ram Koolhaas, it would have been pretty disrespectful if we didn't respond to his theme. The Venice Biennial works also, I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with the format of the biennial, so I'm just going to do a little background. On even years, it's the architecture exhibition, and on odd years, it's the art exhibition. So it happens every summer, and then between that, there's also the film festivals, and there's contemporary dance, and all sorts of Venice Biennial exhibitions. But namely, it's the art and architecture exhibition, and I thought it was really interesting that this year I was appointed to curate the architecture exhibition when my background is in visual arts, and I was very interested in that relationship between art and architecture, and thought it would be really interesting that Kuwait's kind of, looking at architecture from different perspectives, and so decided to even expand in that direction with assembling a team that kind of hails from different disciplines. In the next slides, I'll introduce you to our research team. And our research team, like I said, they hail from a range of disciplines, including art, architecture, visual and performing arts, theology, history, literature, and so we're 21 researchers that have been meeting every Saturday since September, and for the purpose of this project have been divided into 3 teams. So we have a publication team who's working on kind of the thick architectural research and compiling all of this information on the history of urban development in Kuwait into a publication, which is the legacy of our exhibition, and populating our website with the same information. We also have the fabrication team, which is, yeah, has it hard because they're in charge of like the visual component of our show, which is what gets most attention, right? And so thank you, fabrication team, for being so wonderful, despite the really hardcore critiques. And then we also have, so our third team's the film team. And this is also, so this is an unusual component of our project, which I'll talk to you about a little bit later on in our presentation. So skimming forward. Oh, so these photographs were taken on the roof of the space that we're currently inhabiting. We've been meeting every Saturday, like I said, since September, in different locations. And initially our headquarters was the theater in Hawali, which is a really wonderful location. But it was lent to us by Sayman al-Bassam. And it was really wonderful to work there for a while because the dimensions of the space have similar dimensions as the pavilion. And so we were able to imagine the space that we'd have to kind of build an exhibition for. So that was really helpful. And then later we moved to the former where the Heritage and Restoration Department was before it was in Qibliya, so Souk Shark, and that's really wonderful. And so this photo shoot was staged on the roof, and coincidentally, they had this backdrop that references the work that we're doing, because, I mean, it's a backdrop full of, like, modern symbols of Kuwait. So that was really wonderful. We all agree, and so we've had discussions in September about what is modernity in Kuwait, right? Because we're responding to this theme, absorbing modernity, which means kind of understanding how modernity affected local culture. And we all agree that modernity in Kuwait began with demolition, and which is a really kind of hardcore statement, right? But like, what are the repercussions of that? And so this is a photograph from 1957, from when the Sur was torn down and replaced with what became, or it became Sur Street. And this moment in history kind of symbolizes an expansion, right? So we tear down the wall that encapsulated our old city, and we replace it with a street and five roads that come out of each of the 5 gates that kind of open up the city, right? So this is kind of a very crucial moment. And this happens in 1957. And the next slide, please, is a photograph of the Kuwait National Museum in 1957 as well. So the first Kuwait National Museum was established in 1957 by the statesman Sheikh Abdallah al-Yaber in what was his former residence and the Diwan of Khazal. And so this photograph, we decided that we would focus our participation in Venice on the establishment of a national museum. And because this idea of like owning a museum is quite modern, no? Like the museum institution is like the example par excellence of modernity. What it implies is that you are a culture that has kind of a meta understanding of yourself. No, you're able to reflect, imagine, and portray idea about your own society. And so this is why we chose to focus our participation on this institution. And also because in the Heritage and Restoration Department, it is one of our projects. And that was another important thing for us. Now, it was like to look at the projects that are currently in the hands of the National Council and kind of re-articulate them or shed light on them through Venice or in Venice, or give visibility to these projects in Venice. So this is a photograph of the opening of the Kuwait National Museum, the first iteration. And at the time, the National Council wasn't really the National Council. It was the Ministry of Education and Museums. Correct me if I'm wrong. And then it became the National Council for Culture, Arts and Letters, an arm of the Ministry of Information. This is a ground floor plan of the first Kuwait National Museum. And you'll see that they're very clear on what the objectives are of the institution. The institution is meant to be a place of education and enlightenment. It's not exactly like a school because it kind of addresses other things and is meant to be kind of supplementary to like universities or high schools. But it was always very clear that the role of the musician was to educate society and to encourage progressive thinking, innovation, and thought. And so there's this funny moment in the Kuwait National Museum. You'll see that like a lot of the stuff that's on display was stuff that was like happening or had just happened, you know? And even there's still some overlaps. If you'll go to the next image. This is one of my favorite installations of the old Kuwait National Museum. It's the dry aquarium. And it was this really beautiful installation. Evie describes it fantastically. That's at the basement of the Kuwait National Museum. The walls were painted blue, and they brought in coral reef, and they made these little divers hang from strings, from fishing strings. No? And so this is an immersive experience in the Kuwait National Museum. You walk into the basement and you experience, it's as if you're underwater, you know? And it's kind of stuff that was just happening like pre-oil discovery, right? And then there's also this sort of thing on display. It's clothing and stuff that's still being worn. There's this, like I said, there's a funny moment in the history of the National Museum where the people were seeing stuff that they hadn't yet renunciated. And so I found that to be really interesting. It was like the museum was poaching society to kind of turn modern. Do you see what I mean, where it's like the bit of an overlap? And objects of everyday life that are still very much in use, you know? If the next slide, I grew up playing dama, so it's stuff that's still pertinent to us today. And public art also of everyday objects. Meanwhile, on the island of Felicka, there was also 2 museums opening up, and so there's a proliferation of museums in the late 50s. And I found it to be very interesting that like the museums were inhabiting places that were being regarded as kind of important buildings. So the museum in Felicka, the Archaeological Museum, what am I on about? The Archaeological Museum was established in the chalet of Sheikh Abdallah Salim. And this is a photograph of Tariq Rajab cleaning up some of the stuff that's been dug up and putting them immediately on display. So there's this really nice kind of museum treatment that's kind of very instant. Now it's like as the trenches are being dug up, they're brought in and they're cleaned and they're put on display immediately. And the modesty is really beautiful. The scale of the museum, the scale at which it operates, is very nice. And go on to the next slide. And then there's also this moment that very clearly signifies modernity, is that there's these locations that are then being, if you'll go to the next slide, please. They're being designated heritage sites. So this is also a very kind of strong idea behind modernity. You know, it's like places that were once being inhabited and used are suddenly distanced and become places that attract researchers and archaeologists and users at the same time. It's kind of strange. Of course, back in Kuwait, there's all of this happening. This is the central bank by Arne Jacobsen, which doesn't really look like this today, and we'll address this in our discussion later this afternoon. But what this project does, it looks at kind of modernist projects and the condition of these buildings today to try and understand what it is that our relationship to this architecture says about contemporary society. So this is the central bank by Arne Jacobsen. There's a new central bank being built. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen that. Another image of that. All of the images that we've gathered for the purpose of our project, we've succeeded at getting copyright clearance for, which is a huge accomplishment. We have done things properly, and it's been painful. But it's been really wonderful to know that we have allies at the Aga Khan program for Islamic art and architecture, and that we have allies in London. Like, we have mobilized people all over the world towards this project. And you know, it's crazy that there's sometimes better documentation of things in Kuwait outside of Kuwait than there is in our own country. Like, it's a sad truth, and we'd like to change that. This is an image, we kind of struck gold here, and thank you, Noura Sagar, for setting up this meeting for us. Noura has been a wonderful, wonderful kind of researcher in this project. She scheduled a meeting for us to visit the Al-Qabas archives, and we found loads of really wonderful things. This is a really rare image of a presentation of the Kuwait Towers, and we got really excited because we thought it was actually Malin Bourne who was presenting her design. And it wasn't, because we sent the photograph to her son, Par Lindstrom, and he told us, no, this isn't my mother, my stepmom. What am I? And in the same email, he told us that she was turning 100 years old last month, and so that was really exciting. And he told her that, you know, people in Kuwait are still looking at your architecture. So this is another really wonderful photograph that we were given permission to use by the Aga Khan program. And I really like this photograph because there's a guy who's standing on the skirt of the Kuwait Towers. And it reminds me of that film, Man on Wire. Have you guys seen it? Where he walks on a wire between the buildings. But it's a really precarious moment that's quite satisfying. So the water towers was designed by the partner of Malin Bourne. And this is another symbol of modernity that we're looking at. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs by Rima and Riley Pialeta. I said that wrong, I know. And then back to the Kuwait National Museum. So the Kuwait National Museum was the first architectural competition that was launched for the design of a modern building, right? Or a modern institution. And we decided that we were going to focus on the establishment of the two Kuwait National Museums. But in the second one, what we're doing is we're borrowing the programming to organize our research. And so for those of you who don't know, the Kuwait National Museum compound, the iteration, the Mashal-Koshard iteration, it has 5 buildings, and they're each named different things. So there's building 1, which is the administration and cultural building. It's the building we're sitting in right now. There's building number 2, which is Land of Kuwait. Building number 3, Kuwait of today and tomorrow.
No, it's 4.
No, sorry. Building 3 is Man of Kuwait, and building number 4 is Kuwait of today and tomorrow. And there's this anomaly in the museum compound, which is the planetarium. And so we're organizing all of our findings into this category to try and kind of make meaning so I think the fallout between the two museums, I feel like in the Diwani iteration, we were very much kind of in control, and like the museum was fully populated. And in this version, it was a sudden kind of, the scale changed a lot. And so I'd like to go, with this project, we kind of wanted to go back to when the museum was built and restage the opening of the Kuwait National Museum towards the rehabilitation of its programs. Because it seems like the Kuwait was never fully populated, the Kuwait National Museum was never fully populated. And then the war broke out, and that further traumatized kind of the museum. And it's been a really, really hard road to recovery. And so with our participation in Venice, we would like to do that, essentially. So our space in Venice is exactly the same space that was used in 2012. It's a very, very beautiful location in the Arsenale. And the Arsenale is hard to signal and imagine what's behind me. But if you see, there's two venues at the Venice Biennial. And the two venues are the Arsenale and the Giardini. And the Giardini is an area of Venice. It's a very beautiful location. It's the Gardens of Venice. And that area is reserved for the countries with official or permanent representation at the Venice Biennial. The other venue is the Arsenale, the L-shaped venue behind me. And that's available for countries to rent spaces, so countries that don't have permanent representation. And this thing, it kind of offended us. It's like, what do you mean we're unofficial? You know, like, what the dichotomy between like official and unofficial countries is really funny, or like official and unofficial representation. So, you know, while we're in the Arsenale and we really love our location, we also kind of wanted to infiltrate the Giardini. And so there's something later in this presentation that kind of, we'll talk about that. I think the next slide is a quick rendering of what our space will look like. It's an attempt to reconstruct the Kuwait National Museum courtyard, the courtyard space. Our pavilion is like 18 meters by 17 and a half. So it was kind of screaming at us like, I'm the kind of Kuwait, the Kuwait National Museum courtyard, and that's the area of the museum that we're recreating with the facades of each of the buildings. And so yeah, as I was saying, there's this area in Venice, the Nordic Pavilion in the Giardini is one of the most beautiful pavilions, and everyone knows this. Like they have an amazing sense of aesthetics, and everyone really looks forward to this exhibition. And for the purpose of our project, we managed to do a joint installation with them. It was hard negotiation, but we told them, you know, you guys have designed stuff in our country, and we want to give it back to you. And so we're doing this joint installation that's installing a Maisabil water fountain, a drinking fountain, in front of the Nordic Pavilion, infiltrating kind of the Giardini, and giving the city of water more water, or a sadaqah, to say. And this is Amar and my dad shopping for the water fountain. And that's what, I mean, you guys have seen it, no? And so we're very kind of directly responding to Rem's theme when he says, how is it that local culture absorbs modernity? We're returning to them an example of how in our tradition we have appropriated a form of modern architecture. And then this final component that I was talking to you about, I hope I haven't taken you on like a wild presentation. I hope everyone's still with me. But like I was saying, we're organizing our findings into the categories of the Kuwait National Museum. And like I said, the planetarium of the Kuwait National Museum compound is a strange kind of anomaly, and this kind of space of imagination, right? And so under the planetarium, we're working on under the headline of the planetarium, we're working on a script, and for that script, we're doing a movie, and that's really that's generously being funded by the United Real Estate Company, and the movie is this component of our project that's meant to be developed over the course of the exhibition. So it's a movie that's shot between Venice and Kuwait, in Kuwait and in this funny location called Kuwait in Venice. to continue kind of the project and to bring back something from the project. So to return the visibility of the project, not in kind of a straightforward form of documentation, but in an artistic kind of format. And so that's the film team. That's what the film team and the script writing team is working on. Up until now, it's been insane. Since September, we have welcomed reviews and guest critiques by Anthony Montadas, Gediminas Urbonas, Ezra Examija. These are all professors and architects and artists at Harvard and MIT University. MIT and Harvard University. They're students. We interacted with also the Kuwait University's College of Architecture. And our project continues kind of engaging with local and international communities. And the hope is that will continue kind of working long after Venice. Venice is only one moment of visibility in a large project that aims to restore cultural rigor in Kuwait. And so now this is sort of documentation. These are some images of our early research meetings in Hawali Theater. This is us in Feilaka. This is us with the MIT group visiting Kuwait, up in the Liberation Tower. This is down. We did a fantastic, how would you describe it? It was like a tour of Kuwait, but from this cylinder.
It was an overview of the Kuwait city from Liberation Tower, which was an amazing start for the students to understand how the city worked. And then we took them on a walking tour. So we walked through Kuwait city and they understood how we live.
Yeah, it was basically looking at the city from a bird's eye view and a worm's eye view and that whole thing. But that was also arranged by Noura and a fantastic experience for everyone, because we who have lived here all of our life, I had never been up to the Liberation Towers. That was a real awesome experience. This is us visiting the Dar al-Athar al-Islamiyya collection. And we also got to see the house. This is us on a walking tour of Hawali with architect Ricardo Camacho sitting there in the back. Thank you so much for that, Ricardo. And this is us doing presentations with the Kuwait University's College of Architecture. So the whole, like the Venice Biennial team, KU, and yeah, so we're all sharing presentations at MIT. And this is us having dinner at Shamam. Thank you, Summer, for that wonderful recommendation. It was a wonderful feast. And this is us well, not all of us. Not all of us could go on this excursion. Actually, only I and only Oscar and I. But we actually managed to get on top of the water towers as well. So we've been far and wide with this project, and thank everyone for the support. The project will continue again after Venice, and that's what Hassan's we'd like to talk about the longevity of the project. Thank you.
شكرا علي فريد وحسن حياة.
Thank you.
Good evening. Thanks, Alia, for giving a background on the activities that have taken place during this exercise. It's been great to meet new people and to collaborate for the sake of our culture, for defining it, for developing it, for understanding how it mixes into everything else. I'm going to briefly discuss some of the research findings we had, talking about Kuwait a little bit, about the history, and about how we can take this into our everyday lives and how it can affect other projects. Next, please. I'd like to thank our sponsors. This is truly a great opportunity for public-private participation in a multidisciplinary capacity. This is something that is needed. This is what gets our juices flowing, and how we could start discussing about things and really start questioning what we already know and what we see every day in a different light. And this has been great for me personally, and I'm sure it's been great for everyone else on the team. Next, please. Old Kuwait. In response to Rem's overarching theme for the project, we had to discuss absorbing modernity, 1914 to 2014. And for us to develop a point, an opinion about this, we had to first go and look through the archives, through the data, find out what we could find out about Kuwait before we start selecting something, before we focused on the symbols of modernity, before we looked at the museum in great depth. We started looking at what Kuwait was, going back to our roots. Kuwait was a humble town, a coastal town. It was very much connected to the water, and life was simple, and life was peaceful, and was protected by the sewer that Alia was talking about that was demolished in the 50s. You could see that there was an attention to human scale. Society was very much married to its environment at this point. Next, please. And after World War II, with the exporting of oil, we started importing new materials and new technologies that changed the way we designed our buildings. At the same time, the master plans were being developed to re-strategize everything, to bring a brand new identity to our built environment. And this was made possible by the rapid development of the economy and the further globalization of Kuwait. Next, please. And this modernity kept on growing. And here's a great photo that was found in the KOC archives. It was taken in 1962, and it shows the development of Fahd al-Salam Street, greatly contrasted against the old Kuwait. And you could see here what was emerging. This was something new. It was different. And this is something that to this day we still struggle with defining and having an identity with. And this growth kept on growing over time. And with that came some wonderful works that were imported, acquired. And these are the symbols of modernity that we focused on in our research. Here you could see projects that range from the monumental, the institutional, the leisure infrastructure, the souks, trying to bring life back into the city as it was being erased with the implementation of the first master plan. These are symbols that we had a great time finding out about, but it wasn't easy. To find this information, everyone had to use all their resources to really dig up boxes out of the back of storage containers in Sabhan. But we did it, and we were very proud to present this information, and we're happy. Next, please. And this is how we should be treating our symbols. We should be happy about what we have. Yes, modernity is a difficult thing to deal with. Life as we know it is difficult. It's not easy, but we should always be optimistic. We should always try to find these things that identify us and we identify with. Next. And we could look at the different attitudes towards modernity over time by looking at everyday objects such as money. Here we have two banknotes on the right from the 60s, I believe, very clearly showing old Kuwait and new Kuwait. But in the later banknotes, we see how they tried to marry the two, as if modernity had to be excused by referencing it to the old. So over time, our faith in modernity slowly withered and disappeared. And this is something we have to deal with. This is something we have to bring back. This confidence is required. Next, please. And the attitude towards modernity deals with issues and buildings that are disappearing in front of our eyes. The Chamber of Commerce building on the left. I wish I'd known about this demolition. I would have loved to have one of those concrete faceplates there. A great group. Many of the Biennale participants were involved in this event. Sorry. It was organized by Sarah. Zahra, sorry, who spoke to you earlier. And we must consider what will happen to Sawaber. These are not perfect buildings. They are not idealistic entities. They are things that are unique to Kuwait, and they have to be looked at as such. Next, please. And in the law of antiquities, it very clearly states that the antiquities, the buildings, need to be studied, they need to be preserved, and they need to be recorded. Obviously, this wasn't the case because we had to dig up all that information. If it were available to us, that would have been a great help. And this is something that we think that more of these kinds of participations could achieve. Next. I was part of the publication group. I'd just like to talk for a minute about how we looked at the buildings of the museum, of the Kuwait National Museum, and assigned topics and particular symbols to each one of those. The first building here, where we are, Daniel Joder, who introduced us tonight, wrote a great piece about the difficulties of obtaining information, and she discussed at great length the Kuwait Central Bank building and the transformations that happened over time and what that reflects in today's society. Aisha Sagar discussed many of the symbols that were already discussed, the water towers and other symbols of water, because and she talked about how this over time transformed as the coastline was reconditioned. Our connection between the urban environment and the sea has changed. Sarah Saragosa discusses Man of Kuwait. She discusses what the identities of people were towards modernity. How did they deal, the attitudes towards modernity? How did they react? And how did the sudden transformation after the first master plan, how did that affect social consciousness? And I discuss Kuwait of today and tomorrow. And in this I talk about the master plans and how that affected growth and order within the city. Next, please. And again, I just want to remind everyone that we can have fun with these symbols. And I think this kind of spirit of reclaiming these symbols and making them part of our everyday life can really benefit everyone. We can and can really start some interesting discussions and bring nice motivation towards the future. And I just wanted to relate that to our team. And again, like, we all fell in love with the symbols of Kuwait, and we hope you do the same. Next, please. To look at the future, we have to really consider the things that are being done today. We all acknowledge the need for pedestrian environments. This is something that helps society meet and gather, and was honestly removed and replaced by the automobile with the master plans. And while we need more of these places, we need to really be considerate about their sustainability. A project such as this one is great, and it has done great things for the commercial sector, but the amount of energy it uses to air condition that space is something that needs to be questioned. And on the left, again, great transformations of the environment with the Khiran projects, creating great aesthetics, very marketable products, but is that what is best for the future? Next, please. And here we are today in Kuwait City. Many empty spaces, much congestion, office buildings that are mostly vacant, that are being filled with temporary stopgap measures. How can we take opportunity of these spaces, these voids, and program something that would really benefit Kuwait? How can we get Kuwaitis to start inhabiting these spaces and being productive? Productive in terms of business, productive in terms of occupying the space, but also productive in terms of ideas, in terms of exchange. And this is something that we see can really happen with what we already have. We don't need to demolish all of this to build something new. We just need to think carefully, plan properly, and move forward. As I said, the optimism and the hopes are there. We just need to realize them. Next, please. And here's the contrast between the old and the new Kuwait. Aesthetically, there are similarities, but as you see, there's been a band of reclaimed land around the city, and that has very much changed the condition, the relationship between the person and the environment. And this is where I'd like to leave it off tonight. We were hoping to raise some issues, raise some topics, and bring you all into an active participation about what we discussed.
Yeah, the underlying question here is, what is the future of heritage in Kuwait, right? We at the National Council belong to this department, heritage and restoration, but we haven't really been looking at the future of heritage in sense of like modern architecture. And I think that's what, I mean, with this project and especially with what Zahra is doing is kind of foreseeing what might happen to a series of projects that were commissioned over the 60s, 70s, and 80s that are now kind of endangered. You know, we have a fantastic project, which is the waterfront development project in Green Island, that is literally endangered. And what it meant was really valuable. I mean, it was 22 kilometers of public space that's now kind of at risk, right? So what is the future of heritage? And that's the question with which we'd like to open up our discussion here tonight. Thank you so much for your patience. The project's like crazy. It's like crazy heterogeneous and wants to do and say and be a lot, because I feel not enough opportunities to do and say and be a lot are granted. And so, yeah.
Thank you.
That's it.
Thank you. Now's the time for questions or any relative topics to the discussion. الحين وقت
A
الأسئلة.
microphone's going around.
الميكروفون مع
Yeah.
عبد الله. Okay.
I'd just like to give many, many thanks and we're for all of the team, and we're so proud of you. And thanks a lot for the precious informations that we really happy to hear about it. Thanks a lot for all of you. Inshallah, also we would like to have such a lectures in the nearest future. All the best. نجلاء النقي. شكرا. شكرا.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I really appreciated what I just saw. My name is Manaf Al-Hajri. I like to see the wonderful presentation you just presented as part of an overall broader exercise on the identity of Kuwait, something which not many have worked on, unfortunately, in this country. Nobody is quite sure what Kuwait stands for as an identity, although we know it and we perceive it as up in the air. We know what the values, the key values of Kuwait, what they are, but they're not documented or written or written in stone or in any sort of meaningful monument, unfortunately. Now, and I also appreciate the fact that you're taking your time and Kuwait's time to stop after such modernization for 100 years or whatever, and just to make an assessment of what has happened. But I don't like to see the presentation as a sort of exercise of lamentation on the demolition of the old structures of Kuwait or the old historical buildings, for the simple reason that many observers today, whether they are in Kuwait or outside Kuwait, believe or have, I'm sorry, let me be the opponent's advocate. Many believe that Kuwait is not modern enough. So it's a message that is a little bit contrarian to your message. I don't mean to oppose or anything, but we'd like to, one of the things I would like to see in your presentation, and I'm not an expert in the Beignali events, but it would be nice to also give a couple of options, strategic options, where Kuwait should go in terms of modernization in the context of the region, because we are embarrassingly behind many of our neighbors in terms of modernization. And you're saying a message that is a little bit opposite to what I just said. You're saying that you're demolishing too quickly and too aggressively. So where do we go from here? What sort of strategic options we need to adopt for the future, for our investment decisions, for our infrastructure plans? How can the architectural community be involved in this whole debate? Thank you.
Go for it, yeah.
Well, I think Kuwait is very is a lot more advanced than other Gulf countries, and I think that being modern has to do more with an attitude than actually your landscape. And going back to those images of the first Kuwait National Museum, the fact that we had a museum in the 1950s, like in 57, and we were thinking about how we looked at our own society, is testament to how advanced we are in this country compared to Qatar, that's suddenly going crazy over museums. There is fantastic efforts happening in the UAE in Qatar. But I think that we were very much influenced. I mean, Kuwait has a much more cosmopolitan air to it, and always has been much more cosmopolitan than our Khaliji neighbors. I think that has a lot to do with the fact that we're surrounded by huge cities like Baghdad and Tehran, and that really influenced us here in Kuwait, architecturally and also in terms of our attitude and how receptive we were to other cultures. I mean, Kuwait is very much at ease with other cultures, and people used to come here as if this was Paris. So I think modernity doesn't necessarily have to do with what's happening in terms of the landscape only, but like a value system that I think we just need to be reminded of that, that we have that, and I think maybe one of the other researchers can answer. I mean, Aisha, you probably have a lot to say about that. I'm going to pull the researchers into this conversation because they're really fiery in our debates. And today,
I think the thing is like, basically, طبعاً, Kuwait, as Alia said, maybe was modern earlier, a lot earlier than our other counterparts, of course. And I think the thing is we have that history, but we ourselves don't even know it. Yani, you saw the picture of the central bank. That was the bank in 1976. In 1985, less than 10 years, they started to change the way it looks. And this is a building by a very famous designer. If you go anywhere else in the world, yani, you would find the building the way it actually is right now. But even us, I think, even within the architectural community, to a certain extent, didn't even know that this building looked like that, or even how it changed, or what caused it to change. And there's sort of like a gap in the knowledge. Like I think Hassan and Alia were talking. I mean, we don't really have an archive. To find most of our information, we got it from somewhere else in the world. We didn't find it here because we don't really teach ourselves our history. We just kind of wash over it and glaze over it every single time. We dilute it whenever we want to. And that's a huge problem, personally, I think. And I'm sure a lot of people here agree with me. And I think through this project, we're trying to relearn our history the way it actually happened, where we found out stories that, for example, we never knew. We found out about competitions that, me, as someone who studied architecture here, in fact, wasn't even taught in school. And that's a problem. We don't even know our history. I mean, not many are architects here, but for example, Peter and Alison Smithson had a project here in Kuwait. And as a student, I didn't know that. I only knew that when I grew up and I researched that. And in the architecture world, the Smithsons they have a huge body of work. They have something called a map building, which they kind of developed based partly on a project in Kuwait. And that's something that is ongoing now. I mean, it's a term. And we don't know that history. We don't know that we have sort of the legacy. And I think what Ali and Hassan are saying about demolition is that we have to understand how these buildings happen and why they happen before we start to change them or redress them. Of course, change is bound to happen, but change has to be for the better and not to just wash over things and say, it's easy for us to say, okay, we started as mud brick and look at where we are now. But it's hard for us to think of what, the process in between. And, everyone was happy when all of these things were happening, and we seem to also kind of forget that.
But we should also not forget the rapid transformation that happened when the first master plan took place. All the inhabitants of the old cities were shifted to absolutely new living conditions. And from that, there was a rapid jump. And while everyone was looking at the bright modern future, people's individual lives were affected. And this is something that I think could have been studied further. It could have been observed. I mean, you had one story we heard was the people who were used to sleeping on the rooftops of their houses when they moved to the new house with air conditioning. They slept on the balcony. They were not used to the air conditioning. They were not used to these new conditions. They were not used to the quiet of not having a neighbor right on the other side of your wall. These are all very particular instances and conditions that were sort of glossed over, just like everything else.
Yes, we have a few questions.
Actually, I don't have a question. I had a comment that I wanted to build on this discussion and on Manaf's very important question, and I think building off of what everyone just said. And I think this is why it is sort of a lamentation on the demolition. It's not just about, you know, lamenting demolition for the sake of fetishizing the buildings that are being demolished, but about because with demolition comes forgetting and erasure. And we are forgetting that Kuwait was very modern, and this wasn't just an imported modernity or an acquired modernity as we're discussing here, but this was also a modernity that was internalized in Kuwait by the people who were going through that era. So when we demolish these buildings, like we've just lost the very beautiful and architecturally unique Chamber of Commerce, but with that we're forgetting what that era stood for and represented in Kuwait's history. And as a historian, myself, and as an urban historian, I think that that's a real shame. Like Aisha was saying, we don't know our own history. We don't learn. Me as a Kuwaiti urban historian, I learned everything that I write about now abroad while I was doing my research outside of Kuwait. So this is so important, what this project is doing, having these kinds of discussions, but also understanding that demolition is more than just about erasing buildings. It does become about erasing our own history and our own memory of what that era stood for in Kuwait and where it puts us on the map in relation to our neighbors. And there is the sense of Kuwait somehow falling behind. Kuwait is not as modern as its neighbors. But I like what Alia, what you said, that modernity isn't just about the landscape. It's about something much deeper. And we're forgetting that because we're losing our reference points in the landscape around us. So this is a very important.
And I mean, we've really inconvenienced a lot of people with this project, and I see a lot of faces tonight that of people that I've harassed, we've harassed, and so like we're sort of implicating a lot of people in this project, but not out of malice, but because we want people to get on board with this idea. I mean, like it would be unforgivable to demolish Green Island. Like that is unacceptable. And Noodles, we've been at your house like so many times asking you to let us see your father's archives. And it's, when we come back from Venice, we want to continue kind of like, you know, developing awareness around this project. But 22 kilometers of public space needs to be preserved, and Green Island also with that. And I was just there last week, and I noticed that they turned off the water fountains, and it was kind of it was chilling, because what it means is something's about to happen, isn't it? Yeah.
يعطيكم العافية وكثر الله خيركم. يعني I will now speak in English. First, I'd like to thank Mr. Ali Lioha, National Council, His Excellency, Italian Embassy, representatives of the United Real Estate Company for everything you've put into this. And of course, lastly, this incredible team representing Kuwait in the Venice Biennale this year. That said, I want to reiterate what Farah al-Naqib mentioned just now about demolition. Using the word modernity makes me very nervous because there is a sort of misunderstanding about the use of modernity, I believe, in general. When we talk about modernity, when we speak about modernity, I think it works in parallel with the idea of capitalism and how we address capitalism in the long run. Now, I feel more comfortable with using the word enlightenment rather than modernity. Why? Because enlightenment, as a term of reference, refers more to the social evolution of our consciousness. What, as a national identity, how we view our national identity in the long term, and how we take this understanding of our national identity and then perhaps utilize it to share a united front or to draw a united understanding of what it means to be modern in this time and age. So I think enlightenment comes before modernity, and I think this is what Kuwait has been doing. And I think what your team has been doing as well in the last year is enlightening us, providing us with this data that will provide the platform for further evolution of what it means to have an overall social understanding of our landscape, of the platform that we're addressing today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, Ali, I had a question that I found very interesting from your presentation. You're talking about preserving heritage, and I thought it was very interesting when you talked about how the National Museum used to be under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Education. And that, for me, was interesting, not so much as whose jurisdiction it was, but because it looks at the way we classify things like preserving our heritage, whether it be certain sites or museums. We have our research team talking to us today about how we learn everything a lot about Kuwait history, about urban planning in Kuwait, about the architecture, the previous architecture in Kuwait and what it meant to Kuwait, and unfortunately we learned that abroad. So I was wondering if the team studied the shift when it, heritage sites in Kuwait and the museums were under the Ministry of Education, and what that meant to society, and versus the shift to now, and whether or not you felt that that changed the way that people look at what we view as our history.
Yeah, that's the moment exactly when the National Council went from being the education and museums, from operating under the Ministry of Education to operating under the Ministry of Communication. I don't exactly know the turning point, but I think that our department is a fantastic department inside of the National Council, and Mr. Ali Liorha is here tonight, and Shihab as well, and I think it's their efforts that have really transformed. I mean, I'm proud to say that I belong to the Heritage and Restoration Department of the National Council, because within the government, it really is an exceptional place, and I think that that kind of educational value is retained in our department especially, and I mean there might have been some losses, but I think that our department does an exceptional job of trying to communicate a pedagogical mission. You know, a year and 3 months ago, Zahra and a couple of colleagues at the National Council established a lecture series, and that was meant to be a public educational kind of thing. And our participation in Venice is largely educational. I mean, compared to other countries participating in Venice, it's funny, we're a super young group. And people tell us this when we go there, like, other countries have dinosaurs for curators, you know? And they're like, mashallah, great, you guys are super young. And it's really scary, but like, so in Kuwait, it's seen as an attempt to kind of, you know, get people thinking around a subject. And so it has a very strong educational objective, this project. And I kind of was all over the place, but I don't, maybe, Shab, do you know when it went from being education to being, was Hara? The National Council went for, you do. Yeah, but it, and
94.
in the 90s it went, but
92 and 94. Those are the
I don't know.
94.
There was something really nice when the Kuwait National Museum, especially the museums in Failaka, the way that they dealt with that heritage. We did it like a 3-hour. Shakir, where are you, Shakir? Shakir and I went to Mr. Tariq Rajab's house the day before he traveled for knee surgery. And like I said, we've inconvenienced so many people. But we were like, we have to do this interview with you about the history of museums in Kuwait and what you were doing on the island of Failaka. And it was really interesting, his kind of way of dealing with heritage. You know, he was interested in establishing a museum in a chalet, the chalet of Sheikh Abdullah Salim. And part of the mission to keep this place alive was obviously populating it, but keeping it also, like, every year they redid the mud mortar, and so keeping the technique alive as well, no? And that I found really fascinating. And the people who worked in the museum were the people who also kept it clean and maintained it. There was no maintenance staff. I mean, the curatorial team was the help. You know, it was really nicely kept within the family and kind of beautiful.
Can I just say something back to what you were talking about? First of all, I think it's fantastic that you thought that we were enlightening you guys. But around the idea of modernism. Modernism here in particular, it actually refers to an architectural movement. And that is part of the theme of this year's Biennale. Yani, the idea is to catalog sort of what every country underwent. In Kuwait, that means very different things. You have Al-Ahmadi, which we can say in some ways kind of colonial, in that it came through like, it actually formed through a kind of like British kind of way of thinking. I mean, you still see the houses the way they are today and the transformations that happened there versus what happened inside the city, where we kind of had this tabula rasa condition where, you know, we got the planners, erased everything, which what other places wanted to do and they just didn't. And we had a lot of money and we could afford to actually do that. And then through the pictures that Hassan and Alia were showing, you could see the different iterations of that. Yani, you see like the Kuwait Towers or the waterfront, where it's a different version of modernity. Or you see like Suq al-Wataniya or Green Island, which are kind of more localized in the way that they kind of transformed. So I know we have a different understanding of what modern means now, and maybe that could mean contemporary or hip or whatever, whatever you mean it. But for us, we're kind of looking at the intellectual definition, because again, this is what's missing. And this is what we're trying to bring back. And I invite all of you to come visit our website. We're trying to build it up so it's an actual archive. This museum is supposed to be an archive, and unfortunately, I don't know that it is. I'm sorry. Yeah.
What Renima mentioned about the role of education, the Ministry of Education, and what Mr. Manaf al-Hajri mentioned as well about the evolution of architecture and how it pertains to our current states of being. I think it's very pertinent and it's very crucial that when we talk about modernity, it works in parallel with enlightenment. I think it has to work because what we're seeing in our Gulf counterparts is what's happening is there's an imbalance between modernity that refers directly to capitalism and enlightenment. What we're seeing, there's a lack perhaps in some parts of enlightenment. In Kuwait, I'm very happy to report that, alhamdulillah, and you have made that very apparent today, that we are very enlightened, as our youth population is very much so. And so we're very happy now to take this platform of enlightenment, and we have to start building in a modern way. So I think that's the point. I think was misunderstood a bit. Thank you.
I'd like to add that this is a great opportunity for architects and researchers to try to understand this research that we've collected, this space, and to see what happened. Why is it that we rejected modernity during the 80s, and how, and what is it that part of our identity that wants to stay, that is clinging to the ground, and what part of it wants to leave? So it's a great opportunity to start questioning these and implement them into new architecture, into new building types, into new environments.
Thank you for the great work. One of the things that we have to consider in a Beiynali is the audiences. Who is going to visit that pavilion? And this is an international community that come from all over, tourists and artists and architects. If this was a history class, a theory class, I would accept the dialogue that has been going on. A lot of information collected, period. I don't see the approach of presentation that will take place in Venice. When I go to a pavilion, I want to see some sort of delight and celebration. How are you going to do that? Thank you.
Well, did you see the rendering of the pavilion? Did you see that slide? The rendering of what we're with the two columns. It's a sort of so like I said, Venice, it's wild, isn't it? There's approximately 2,000 people visiting the space every day. That's what's been counted. And it's exhausting. I mean, you're going through 52. I don't know if you're able to put that on there. Are you able to? It was the rendering where there was the columns from the courtyard, and there's a drawing of the architect, one of the original drawings of the Kuwait National Museum, sort of surrounding or wrapped around the space. But basically, what we're doing is we're recreating kind of the courtyard situation of the Kuwait National Museum in our pavilion, and we're restaging the opening to kind of go back in that moment in time and said, if we could start again, how could we maybe give meaning to these headlines that were suggested by the architect? And so what does it mean? Like, what is the meaning of man of Kuwait? What is the meaning of land of Kuwait? What is the meaning of Kuwait and of today and tomorrow? And try to kind of populate those headlines with information. The information will not be displayed in the space because we agreed that would be really overwhelming. And for a visitor that had just gone through 52 pavilions, there's really no kind of ability to take it in, right? And so we focused on making our pavilion sort of an immersive space and inviting, with clues, the visitor to visit our website, to obtain a publication, to visit the joint installation with the Nordic Pavilion, and to look forward to this film that would travel. What will happen inside? For the opening, we're having a big celebration. So we're restaging, hence the photographs, hence the banners. You know, there's the documentation that exists around the Kuwait National Museum is also mostly around celebrations. And we found that kind of very peculiar. You know, like the only time you see like the museum documented is for the visit of Princess Diana, the opening. And so we're restaging the opening and kind of calling it the starting point. And there's a sound installation that kind of, you know, reminds people of a sort of celebration, and that's what's happening in the pavilion.
I think that it's a very interesting question to ask about being in a space and trying to understand what you're getting from it. I think that this is a very big project that doesn't aim to tell everybody everything. The project, as we've said before in other discussions, isn't just for the people in Venice. It's for us, it's for Kuwait, it's for discussion. And so, like Alia has said, it is one moment of visibility. It's a moment where we are present in an international participation, but it exceeds more than that. And I think that articulation in that space doesn't need to be overwhelming and overfed, but I think that a proper articulation in the multiple components of our project will hopefully do justice or kind of make that a cohesive, full, large, smart body of work, not just for the 2 minutes that you walk through one space.
Right, because we don't really need another.
Ms. Badr, I have a question about the space. It seems that modernism had a lot to do with bringing, with extending the inside outside. But what's been successful in Kuwait is bringing the outside inside. So did that somehow factor into the fact that you're trying to recreate a courtyard inside the space in Venice?
Oh, you mean, so, I thought you were talking about the inside outside, like literally. Did you understand that?
He's saying if you referred to that in the design of the
We were with the title "Acquiring Modernity." We did refer to that idea of like importing, but we also mean acquiring in the sense of like learning. You know, acquiring is not only about kind of purchasing things, but kind of acquiring meaning, and acquiring kind of an understanding for something, or a taste. And so that our title, our reciprocal title, has that double meaning. The inside outside, I think that the courtyard space in the Kuwait National Museum compound is the most successful space of this building, and it's a place where you're able to look at the kind of the four buildings in the planetarium and reflect on their role and the role of the institution, and that's what we're doing in Venice. Now we've got the facade there, we've got the headlines. Now let's think about how we can repopulate the space to make it a healthy, functioning space. I hope that answers your question.
One more question at the bottom.
We should have it.
Hassan, you talked about the old and the new, and about the fast demolition of the city and leaving behind a lot of empty spaces, which I felt a sad tone in your voice. Is there a master plan? Do we have a master plan for the city?
Well, there's always a master plan. One master plan continues into the other.
We don't feel it.
Huh?
We don't feel the master plan.
That's true, because it's never allowed to carry through till the end. The latest master plans are about human development, social development, economic development. And maybe by taking that approach and thinking about humans, maybe they can come later on and help build a better built environment.
Right, the master plans are at such a large scale that you completely oversee it. You oversee the Kuwaiti man, the man of Kuwait.
Actually, it's not. First of all, I want to echo everyone's comment about what a great job you're doing. In terms of master plan, we don't have proper urban, planning in Kuwait, and if we want to see enlightenment to continue and be effective, then we need to have the youth and we need to have young people with drive and with vision in urban planning committees in the government and probably in boardrooms of companies and in the corporate world that funds and drives these initiatives through the collaboration, as you mentioned, Mr. Hayat, between the private and the public sector. Because at the end of the day, given the examples that you've given in some of these developments, yes, there is the commercial aspect is always in the real world, with the private sector especially, is the most dominating factor. And that, unfortunately, supersedes and dominates sustainability and how we impact the environment that we are in the architectural form. So as for the government, that's a whole different story. That's about master plan. So, we need proper urban development. Thank you.
Just one small comment. I started to follow the issue from the very beginning, because physically I went to Venice to say the time was arrived to have Kuwait as part of the Biennale. So I'm very happy to see how much you have been, how much work in these last 2 years you did. So this is the first thing, and congratulate all of you. The second point is, I came from a country which has some thousands of histories, which has some monuments everywhere in our cities. And so this kind of debate is our daily bread. And I'm very, very happy that the Biennale of Venice can help all of you to touch with your hands that this kind of debate we all need to have better environment, better cities, better visions on what human beings they can live in their spaces. So I'm really happy that such a group of commitment of young who are so committed in this project are involved, and I really wish you all the best. Keep going, keep working like that. Thank you.
I'd like to add something. First, thank you very much for the wonderful presentation, and it was so good to hear all the young people, how they're working so enthusiastically in doing this. But I would just like to say that this should be just the beginning. And I hope that the Biennale will not be the end of this effort, and then this will spread into other institutions, not just into the research and archives, because that's not enough. In Kuwait, that needs to go beyond, to go to Baladia, to go to ministries, to go to other organizations, to understand and realize employees there who are decision makers or grantors of any competition or any approval of the designs or renovation or demolishing, to understand all this. Because only like that, this will fulfill its own meaning. The Biennale is one point in time, but everything else will have to lead later on. Yeah, in Kuwait, there have been 3 master plans, major ones done, and they were all imported because the teams who worked, they didn't have sensibility of this city. And luckily now there is a huge number of young architects, young force in Kuwait, who is well educated, who is enthusiastic, and who should be on board either in the real estates or in the authorities or in the government and their private offices to take forward all this and to take hold of the city. But also, yes, not to forget what was built. Kuwait has beautiful architectural legacies also, which came with the Moderna, which came with the money and the funds, and that should be celebrated. I mean, you have buildings from all the major architects of that era, starting from Kenzo Tange or John Hudson or anybody else whom you mentioned already. And those buildings are now being sort of distorted, and they're getting lost. And it's a pity, because everywhere in the world that's being celebrated and it's being recorded in the books. Here there is no even in the lecture books mentioned what you have in the city. And there are a lot of individual houses from the Moderna around the residential areas, which are wonderful examples of that era, and should be somehow preserved. I think there is a hard time to preserve Begbehani complex and the buildings next to Amiri Hospital, but there are buildings from the 60s and 70s which are also as much valuable, and that should be done an effort. So good luck in Venice, and I just hope that this will continue.
Dear guests, thank you for your attendance and support, and thank you AUK for documenting this event. It will be uploaded on the website for us to see. We wish to see you again, AUK. We wish to see you again in Venice. The website for Architecture of Kuwait is aok.com. The website for Acquiring Modernity, our pavilion, is www.acquiringmodernity.com. If you can enlist your name, I know it's being uploaded and it will be ready for the opening June 4th to 7th. If you can just add your name to the mailing list, we will send you daily updates. And that's it. Thanks for coming. Please use the main exit for the dinner buffet.